In a world where names like Skinny Gandalf and Weed Goblin are not only accepted but cherished, we find ourselves in quite the peculiar tale. Meet Skinny Gandalf, a spry 68-year-old with a name that echoes his gaunt yet towering figure, and a beard that would make even the wizard himself envious. He carries the wisdom of his years in his eyes, yet his spirit is as youthful as a spring chicken. His partner in crime? None other than his 25-year-old son, Weed Goblin. A name that was probably inspired by a late-night snack binge. But hey, it stuck. This father-son duo shares more than just their unique names. They're in the family business, and no, it's not your typical mom-and-pop shop or a generations-old farm. They're in the business of smuggling nose candy across the American-Mexican border, adding a dash of thrill to their otherwise mundane lives. Skinny Gandalf, with his age-defying agility, and Weed Goblin, with his tech savviness, make for a rather unusual yet effective team, darting in and out of the border like phantoms in the night. Their modus operandi? Well, let's just say it involves a lot of creativity, a pinch of audacity, and just enough luck to keep them out of handcuffs. But as they say, every day is not Sunday. And for our dynamic duo, their string of lucky Sundays was about to run out. A certain someone by the name of El Mustard, a notorious cartel boss with a penchant for condiment-inspired monikers, was about to spice up their lives in more ways than one. And so, our story takes a sharp turn when Skinny Gandalf falls into the clutches of El Mustard. But fear not, because Weed Goblin, with his quick thinking, manages to evade capture and finds himself in the land of the free. Now let's dive into the story where things go south. And by south, I mean way, way south. Picture this, Skinny Gandalf. The seasoned smuggler is kidnapped by none other than El Mustard, the cartel boss with a name that adds a tangy twist to our tale. Now, Skinny Gandalf is no spring chicken, but he's got more tricks up his sleeve than a magician at a kiddie party. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It all started one sultry afternoon when Skinny Gandalf was doing what he does best, smuggling nose candy. Just as he was about to cross the border, a sombrero-clad figure appeared from the shadows. That's right, folks. It was El Mustard, the man with the zest of 1,000 lemons and the ruthlessness of a cat on catnip. El Mustard, with a swiftness that belied his girth, swooped down on Skinny Gandalf. Our seasoned smuggler tried to make a run for it, but alas, he was no match for El Mustard's spicy speed. In the blink of an eye, Skinny Gandalf found himself bundled into a van faster than you can say guacamole. The van was as nondescript as they come, but inside it was a party. There was a mariachi band in the corner, a couple of chihuahuas wearing party hats, and a disco ball twirling from the ceiling. You might be thinking, that doesn't sound too bad. But let me tell you, getting serenaded by a mariachi band while being kidnapped by a cartel boss is not a fun experience. The journey was a blur of desert landscapes and mariachi music. Skinny Gandalf, the ever-optimistic, tried to bond with his captors through a game of I Spy. He started with, I spy with my little eye, something beginning with K, hoping they'd guess kidnapped. But they kept guessing kangaroo. After the 20th kangaroo, Skinny Gandalf gave up and resigned himself to his fate. Meanwhile, Weed Goblin managed to sneak into America, leaving his dear old dad to the mercy of El Mustard. Trust me, folks, this tale is just getting spicier. In America, Weed Goblin found his long-lost mother, Doritos. Yes, you heard it right, Doritos. Like the chips. Now, Weed Goblin hadn't seen his mom in 5 long years, so you can imagine the emotional reunion. It was like a scene straight out of a teary-eyed soap opera, except with more laughter and less dramatic background music. After the initial shock wore off, they settled in the living room of Doritos' quaint, cozy home. Weed Goblin, ever the curious one, couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room, or rather the Gandalf in the family tree. He asked his mom, "Why did you lie about my father being Mexican?" Doritos, taken aback, denied such accusations. But when Weed Goblin mentioned Skinny Gandalf, her eyes widened, and she began to unravel a story that would put any telenovela to shame. It turns out she had an affair with El Mustard, a notorious cartel boss, while she was married to Skinny Gandalf. El Mustard was deported to Mexico before he could even know about his son Emmanuel, also known as Weed Goblin. 5 years later, Doritos and Skinny Gandalf divorced. Skinny Gandalf always believed Weed Goblin was his son, but Doritos never told him the truth. She never even mentioned Skinny Gandalf to Weed Goblin. Now, that's a plot twist worthy of a standing ovation, isn't it? Weed Goblin, understandably, needed some time to process this revelation, Instead of getting mad, he decided to go to his childhood room, needing some time alone to deal with the whirlwind of emotions. But despite all the drama and revelations, his spirit remained unbroken. He was, after all, the son of a cartel boss. And that, my friends, is how Weed Goblin discovered he was the son of El Mustard, the cartel boss. As if the day wasn't eventful enough, Weed Goblin was about to receive another shock. The room was thick with tension as Doritos cleared her throat, preparing herself to deliver the next piece of news. "Weed Goblin," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else you need to know. Your brother, Phagozoid." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "He's gone, caught up in a tornado. We never found his body." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling in Weed Goblin's mind. His brother, Phagozoid, the one he'd been so eager to reconnect with, was no more. The news hit him like a freight train, leaving him breathless, his heart pounding against his chest like a desperate prisoner. You see, Phagozoid wasn't just a brother to Weed Goblin. He was a confidant, a partner in crime, a beacon of light in the otherwise dark and twisted world they were born into. They had shared dreams, hopes, fears, and even the same sense of humor, often finding comedy in the strangest of places. And now he was just gone. Weed Goblin didn't say much after that. He simply nodded, his face a mask of stoicism. But inside he was a tempest, a whirlwind of confusion, anger, sorrow, and a million other emotions he couldn't quite put a name to. He was mourning a brother he hadn't seen in years, a brother he'd never get to see again. As the night fell, Weed Goblin retreated to his childhood room, the same room he'd shared with Phagozoid all those years ago. The walls echoed with the laughter and whispers of two mischievous boys, now one a man grappling with loss, the other a memory fading into the abyss. He lay on his old bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield. Thoughts of his lost brother tangled with the revelation of his true lineage and the worry for his kidnapped father, Skinny Gandalf. It was a lot to process, a lot to come to terms with. And so, Weed Goblin decided to rest, his mind filled with thoughts of his lost brother, his kidnapped father, and his newfound lineage. The night was long and the journey ahead even longer. As dawn broke, Weed Goblin had a mission. He was going to rescue Skinny Gandalf. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed the guidance, the wisdom, and the slightly questionable driving skills of his mother, Doritos. With a gulp of courage, he presented her with his plan, his eyes pleading with the same intensity of a puppy begging for a piece of bacon. Doritos, after a long pause that felt like eternity, finally gave a slow nod of agreement. With that, they were off. Doritos tossed Weed Goblin the keys to their ride, a Ford that had seen better years, probably around the time when disco was still a thing. The Ford, or as Weed Goblin liked to call it, the mechanical embodiment of Murphy's Law, was a sight to behold. It was the color of a gloomy day with patches of rust that gave it a charming, "I've survived a zombie apocalypse" look. The vehicle creaked and groaned as if it was auditioning for a role in a horror movie. Despite its many quirks, it was their only ticket to Mexico. They hit the road, the Ford protesting every mile with a symphony of clanking and clunking sounds. Doritos, who had a soft spot for the old relic, patted the dashboard encouragingly as if to assure it that it could indeed make it. Weed Goblin, on the other hand, was convinced the Ford had a personal vendetta against him. He could swear it shuddered maliciously every time he touched the gear stick. Through potholes and bumps, they journeyed on, their determination unwavering. They were like those brave explorers from the olden days, minus the cool hats and the reliable transportation. They shared stories, laughter, and the occasional roadside snack, all while the Ford continued its theatrical performance of "I might break down any moment now." And so, our unlikely heroes set off on a journey across the border, hoping that the Ford would hold up. This was just the beginning of an adventure that promised a lot of laughs, some tears, and one very unhappy Ford. Our heroes found themselves in the middle of nowhere, with a broken Ford and miles to go. The Ford, shiny and new, was a sight to behold, but as they say, looks can be deceiving. It was as reliable as a chocolate teapot in the middle of a desert. Weed Goblin, ever the optimist, popped the hood with the enthusiasm of a kid opening a candy wrapper. He stared at the engine, a labyrinth of metal and wires, like an alien artifact. To him, it was as comprehensible as quantum physics is to a 3-year-old. Meanwhile, Doritos, ever the pragmatist, started rummaging in the trunk. She unearthed a toolbox that looked like it had seen the better part of the last century. The rusty wrench was about as helpful as a chocolate fireguard, and the screwdriver, well, it had seen better days. Our dynamic duo tried their best to revive the Ford. Weed Goblin poked around the engine with the finesse of a bull in a china shop, while Doritos held a flashlight, illuminating his confusion rather than the engine. The Ford, however, remained as responsive as a brick wall. Realizing their efforts were as fruitful as trying to squeeze water from a stone, they finally conceded defeat. The Ford, it seemed, had taken an early retirement. It was as useful as a glass hammer at this point. So, with a sigh of resignation, they abandoned the Ford, standing alone in the vast expanse of the desert, a monument to their failed mechanical endeavors. But our heroes weren't the type to let a minor setback like this dampen their spirits. With a shrug of his shoulders, Weed Goblin said, "Well, Ma, looks like this horse ain't gonna ride." And with a chuckle, Doritos replied, "Son, we got two perfectly good legs each, don't we?" And so they set off on foot. Their journey far from over, their spirits unbroken, their determination unwavering. After all, who needs a Ford when you have two perfectly good legs, right? Just when things seemed bleak, they stumbled upon an old gas station and a rusty car that promised a glimmer of hope. Now, I know what you're thinking. A rusty car? That's their glimmer of hope? But folks, in the middle of the desert, when your Ford has given up the ghost, a rusty car is like finding a cold soda in the Sahara. They approached the car with a mix of desperation and relief. The car, an old Chevy, was the color of a desert sunset, its paint peeling in places, revealing a canvas of rust underneath. It was a relic from a bygone era, a mechanical phoenix ready to rise from the ashes of abandonment. Weed Goblin turned the key, and the engine coughed to life like an old man waking from a nap. The car might have been rusty, but its heart was still beating. It was a symphony to their ears, a sweet mechanical lullaby that promised them a chance to continue their journey. With a grin that could have rivaled the Cheshire Cat, Weed Goblin revved the engine, the rusty Chevy responding with a growl that echoed across the deserted landscape. Doritos, despite the dire circumstances, couldn't help but chuckle. Who would have thought that a rusty old car could inspire such joy? They hit the road, the Chevy leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, a testament to their perseverance. As they drove, the barren landscape transformed, slowly giving way to the outskirts of a small town. The town's name was El Pueblo, a place forgotten by time but remembered by El Mustard. As they drove into El Pueblo, the rusty Chevy seemed to fit right in. The town was a patchwork of faded colors and weathered faces, each telling their own story. It was the heart of El Mustard's territory, a place where danger lurked around every corner. But Weed Goblin and Doritos were undeterred. With the rusty car as their steed, they were ready to face whatever El Mustard had in store for them. With the rusty car proving to be a better companion than the Ford, they drove into the heart of El Mustard's territory. It was time for the showdown. It was time to rescue Skinny Gandalf. With Doritos at his side, Weed Goblin had a newfound sense of courage. They were in the heart of El Mustard's territory, a dusty town named El Pueblo. This was no place for the faint-hearted. But you know what they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Now imagine this, there's Weed Goblin, a young man who couldn't even fix a Ford about to take on a Mexican cartel. It's like a Chihuahua challenging a bulldog. But this Chihuahua had a secret weapon. His mom, Doritos, a woman that could charm the scales off a snake. With a plan as wild as a coyote on hot sand, they snuck into El Mustard's fortress. It was more like a rundown warehouse than a fortress, but hey, one man's trash is another man's treasure. They navigated through the labyrinth of crates filled with, well, let's just say not sugar. Suddenly, they spotted Skinny Gandalf, tied up, looking more like a starved Santa than a Gandalf. Seeing his father in such a state, Weed Goblin's heart clenched tighter than a cowboy's fist in a bar fight. It was time for the grand rescue. Weed Goblin, with all his might, tried to silently untie his father. But you know, in situations like these, silence is as elusive as a cat in a dog pound. A squeaky crate, a gasp, and bam! The whole place was on high alert. Chaos ensued. It was like a Wild West showdown, only the cowboys had swapped their horses for forklifts. Amidst the pandemonium, our unlikely heroes managed to free Skinny Gandalf and make a daring escape, leaving El Mustard's men scratching their heads in disbelief. As they drove away, the reunion was nothing short of emotional. Tears flowed freely, mixing with the dust on their faces. It was a moment of joy, relief, and a dash of absurdity, just like their journey so far. Skinny Gandalf was rescued, but the story doesn't end here. In an unforeseen twist, Doritos and Skinny Gandalf chose diverging paths, forever bidding each other farewell. Their decision introduced an undeniable sense of realism to their saga, as they no longer saw each other. Meanwhile, Weed Goblin, our young protagonist, was not excluded from the storyline. He uncovered a fresh position in this unorthodox family and rose to prominence in the smuggling profession. He would still smuggle nose candy with Skinny Gandalf and visiting Doritos every trip initially, fortifying their bond. And in their world, that held the utmost importance.